This is the Reason interview with Nick Gillespie, and I need to tell you something really, really, really important about economic and political scams. You don't get conned because you're stupid. You get conned because you're human. That's the urgent message of today's guest, Brian Brushwood. He's an Austin-based magician, podcaster, and professional skeptic. With shows like Scam Nation and The Modern Rogue, he's taught millions of us how to upgrade our BS detectors in a world where truth is more up for grabs than ever before. We talk about the world's greatest con, his mind-blowing podcast series where he unpacks grifts like Disney World's authoritarian Epcot Center, the psychic soldier panic of the Cold War, and the myth that the French used magic tricks to subdue colonial Algeria. Along the way, we also look at how media monocultures used to gatekeep truth, and how the chaotic pluralism of the internet is both a blessing and a curse. Brushwood's a dyed-in-the-wool libertarian who celebrates decentralization, transparency, and personal agency, even, maybe especially, when it's messy. We talk about the influence of performers like the amazing Randi and Penn and Teller, why teaching magic online pissed off the old guard, and why skepticism has to evolve or die in a world full of customized realities. Buckle up for a fast, fun, head-spinning ride through epistemology, performance, and freedom. Here is the Reason interview with Brian Brushwood. Brian Brushwood, thanks for talking to Reason.
Thank you for having me, man.
Okay. I want to, you are a podcaster, a magician, a debunker of bullshit and things like that. I want to start off by talking about your series, The World's Greatest Con.
Yeah.
Okay. What's the catchphrase?
Cons don't fool us because we're stupid. They fool us because we're human.
Okay. So let's talk about some of the episodes of that. And you had a 2-part episode about Epcot Center.
Oh, yeah.
One of the world's biggest cons. Tell me about that.
Okay. So whether it's the greatest in terms of it has the longest shadow of history, whether it's the greatest in terms of scale or the stakes, the very first season was about Operation Mincemeat, which later became a Netflix movie. And in that case, Ian Fleming, of all people, helped to design a Trojan horse, a haversack ruse, where they took a dead body, filled it with pocket litter that told a false story.
Right.
And
in World War II,
to
get the Nazis to chase the wrong story.
Basically Hitler defended the wrong coast.
Right.
And depending on how you squint, like that won the war.
Right.
And what I loved about that story is that, like a good magic trick, you never say, a good magician, Teller once told me, that the cardinal sin of all magicians is that they say what they're going to do and then do it. That's the definition of bad magic. The moment you hear a magician say, I have an ordinary deck of cards, guess what? Yeah. Right? So instead, what you need to do is lay the elements in front of someone, let them come to the incorrect conclusion, while you, blameless, let them misremember things and they're left only with mystery. I perceive the job of the magician to be to play chess with the audience. And there's 2 ways to be the best chess player in town. One is to read all of the book moves, study the greats, practice until you're the best. The other is to form a cartel and say, nobody's allowed to know the rules of chess except us. Right. And that traditionally has been how magicians have operated.
But that's hard to do now, right? Because all secrets emerge finally.
Yeah, well, and Scam School, my show where I teach magic, that was on the forefront, the bleeding edge, where magicians didn't know, was I exposing magic or teaching magic? Right. And that ended up being its own thing. But it struck me early on, especially while doing Scam School, that the structure of a good magic trick is identical, 1 for 1, with the structure of a scam or a con. You lay everything out, you let them come to the false conclusion, and then you accelerate things until they're left. In the case of magic, the good version, the white hat hacking of wetware systems, they get checkmated and they're left only with wonder. I cannot reconcile what I saw with what just happened. In the black hat version, you're defrauded and you have no money, right? And so in the case of, usually when we see stories of cons, it's rare that you see a morally just con man. Usually it's somebody who, I don't know, their past catches up to them, what have you. The idea of recasting the 20 committee and their bold, audacious plan as a con. And who knows, for every one success, who knows how many failures there were,
Right.
but it's truly wonderful. And so we did that. We did a season of game show cons. You've heard the legendary story. It's about to be a movie about the guy who won Press Your Luck
Right.
by figuring out the pattern
Yes.
on
Yeah,
there,
yeah.
Michael Larson.
No whammies.
Yeah, exactly. Most people don't know he was, I believe, somebody will fact check me because of the internet. I believe that the FBI said he was the very first person to perpetrate an internet fraud. Like him on Usenet news groups was running a lottery scam or something. And at any rate, so we did a whole series on game show scams,
Right.
and in that world. And then the third season, which I think we tricked you into listening to, was the one on Project Alpha.
Well, let's get to Project Alpha in a minute. I want Epcot.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Tell me, like, lay out quickly, what is the con? Because, Disney World in Florida, starts as like a giant version of Disneyland in California. And it's, it opened in the early 70s and they started building it in the mid 60s.
Yeah.
But then what about Epcot Center? Why is that a con?
Well, first of all, it began with the curious fact when I ran across, I found out, I was like, why is a privately held company in Florida legally entitled to handle enriched uranium?
Yeah.
And from there, you work backwards. And it's like, well, because they wanted legal status to create the city of tomorrow. And they didn't know what kind of energy they were going to run on. So let's just say we can handle all of it. If we want a nuclear reactor, we can have a nuclear reactor. And then you keep going backwards from that. And you find out that the pitch for Epcot was not the objectively best part of Disney World, because it's drink around the world is the best thing on the planet. But it began as basically Silo or Fallout, this totalitarian, highly structured, all of you are going to have the same toaster. And because this month we have signed an agreement with General Electric, we're throwing out your Westinghouse toasters.
Right.
You're going to have this and also you're going to be things to be gawked at as people walk around. And the wild part is part of the reason that existed, that hellscape of totalitarianism, or the pitch for it, came from the fact that Disney wanted so much more freedom, but had to deal with so many restrictions and regulations, and Disneyland ended up being so compromised from what he wanted it to be.
Right.
If you go to the Walt Disney Family Museum in San Francisco, it is very much not a Disney corporate institution. It's the Family Museum, which means there's a whole wing dedicated to how much he hated unions and how much he resented the strikes and so on.
Right.
And so to pull off Epcot, they knew that they needed just an obscene amount of land. And in order to buy that land, they knew that everything had to be secret. So there's a series of shell corporations, and there's a lot of moments when it looks like the cat's about to be out of the bag. And so part one is can we get the land? Can we build it? But then we lose our protagonist right at the height of this.
Yeah, because Walt Disney dies.
Exactly, right? And then at that point...
is not frozen and living underneath, or frozen underneath.
I still have my fingers crossed.
Okay.
We'll see. But it ends up being like, imagine Ocean's 11, but right halfway through the movie, Danny Ocean dies.
Right.
And also the other 10 people don't really care about this heist, but they all feel this need to complete it for the shareholders.
And Walt Disney he wanted to build a true, living, thriving community, a city of tomorrow. And that's kind of what he was selling.
Yes. Yeah. Or that was the dream he was selling. And, it ended up becoming more and more compromised, and we got something, and what we got was delightful, but it is not what Disney had envisioned.
Yeah.
Thankfully, actually, because what he envisioned was objectively a hellscape.
And that is, that's partly because he's thinking in kind of mid-century terms, like the perfect city. It was perfect for him because everybody would do what he wanted, or would fill out his aesthetic landscape.
Well, and it's funny because when you say it out loud, the actual plan, it does sound like pure fiction. Like, I'm going to describe for you a place where the good people are at the surface up top, where everything is green and lush and there are no filthy automobiles. And beneath them, literally beneath them, will be the people who make sure that the good people have everything they need. And beneath them will be all the filthy automobiles coming and going.
Whatever.
Exactly.
So you also, I can't remember if it's that season or a different one, you also tell a story about Robert Houdin, the great French magician who supposedly, at the behest of the French government when they were having trouble with Algerians, which had recently become a French colony, Houdin goes to demonstrate that the French have superior magic. Can you lay out this story and first lay out the story as we know it or as it's received, and then what's the twist?
Yeah, this one was a one shot because it was always a just so story. And when we started investigating it, we had hoped that there was more to the story. The story, as magicians love to tell it because it glamorizes magicians, is...
And Houdin, in the 19th century, I mean, he kind of invented modern magic. And he was such a big figure that Houdini became Houdini by adding an I to Houdin.
Correct. Yeah. Jean-Eugène Robert Houdin is the canonical top hat and tails magician. Right. And as Penn and Teller point out, the reason he wore that was because everybody else was dressed as wizards at the time. And he wanted to be of the people, to my magician mind, and like, he got it. The game is to play chess and cause wonder, right? So the story that magicians love to tell is, this is antiquated language, please forgive me, the internet, but savages in Algeria had believed in magic, and to calm them down, the French government enlisted the great Robert Houdin, who using an using a secret method, had something that a powerful person could not lift, but a child could. And it's,
I'll ruin it so that you don't miss your cut. It's an electromagnet, so it's like a little box that when the juice is turned on, nobody could lift it.
Correct.
But otherwise, like anybody could.
Yeah, and it's literally how security doors work at 7-Elevens.
Right. Now. And you bring, you have like, a huge, brutish, strong man from Algeria come up and he can't lift it. And then any little kid or Houdin can, and the guy goes screaming from the stage.
And the canonical version is he leaves, turns, and says to the audience, "My magic is too weak against the French magic."
And then the savages, fall into line and they put up with 100 years of French occupation.
Right. A peace is achieved until it isn't.
Right.
But upon examining it, that story collapses. And this is the beauty of having a flexible title like World's Greatest Con, because what starts off as a story sounding like the French pulling a con on the Algerians becomes, no, it's us who had the con pulled on us, because everything traces back to a single source, an old man's autobiography with no corroborating evidence whatsoever.
How did you find that out?
Simply by going back. And there have been greater historians, which is to say historians. There have been historians who pointed out like, well, here's what we know. We know he toured. We know he had a magic shop. And we know that most people know him from his autobiography. There's a quiet period during which the dust settles. And I would imagine an old man might lengthen the shadows on a lot of these tall tales.
So let's talk about Project Alpha, which is a season long. What was Project Alpha?
So that was a wild one because, and I'd be curious to hear your take on this. I couldn't even begin to tell the story without setting the landscape. And it is hard to convey to anybody under the age of 30 just how insane, when communication was limited to the monoculture, the big three networks, when the only intel we had as to what was going on in the Iron Curtain was clearly propaganda. Out come these tales of essentially psychic soldiers, Soviet psychic soldiers. And again, whether it's real or not, spoiler alert, it was not, it made sense. If there was going to be an arms race, if only for the PR reasons, America needed to be armed.
And so, people hear stories that somewhere in the Soviet Union, they are training people who can bend spoons and needles with their minds. And it's like, God damn, we got to get to the moon first, and we got to be able to bend spoons better than anybody.
Well, and it's interesting you mentioned the moon, because the speculation is, if what you want is the PR win, why actually go to the moon? And essentially, when it came to psychic soldiers, that's exactly what Soviets did. Is they're all like, hey, does it matter? Can we just tell everyone that we have magic powers?
So that and the beginning of the series does a great scene setting of what it was like living in a world with a lot less knowledge and a lot less, kind of transparency on stuff. And particularly in the 70s, there was a boom in all kinds of parapsychology or paranormal stuff. And you point to, major universities that were funding basically like, psychic labs.
Yeah. Well, and you see this anytime there's a big advancement in technology. In the 19th century, in a world where suddenly we're able to have telephone communication across the Atlantic Ocean, why not a version of that to the great unknown afterlife?
Right.
And so you see the rise of spiritualism, right? In the 1970s, in this post-atomic nuclear age, why wouldn't these things work? And oftentimes, and we still see this today, we see statistically small samples that aren't double-blind peer-reviewed. For example, Chevreul's pendulum, Michel Eugene Chevreul, he had heard about dowsing, and so he took an empty bowl, held a pendulum over it, did nothing, put a bowl filled with mercury, started going nuts all over, and then put the empty bowl and it was calm again. And he was like, sacre crap, because he was French. And then he correctly thought, what if I'm unconsciously affecting this? Had a partition set up, and once he didn't know whether the bowl was filled or not, he figured out, and this is the beginnings of the double-blind experiment. And when it came to early parapsychology, it's so internal, it's so personal, because we've all had that experience. For those of you who remember picking up a phone and expecting a dial tone and instead getting the exact party that you intended to call, that feels like magic. And likewise, we all remember the time we had a song stuck in our head. We start up the car and it's playing that exact song. We remember the hits and we forget the misses, just like every night you dream a bunch of crazy stuff, but you remember the dream where it happens to be a premonition of 9/11 or whatever. So most people are not statisticians or economists, or they don't think of these, I'm remembering the hits and not the misses, and the unconscious biases. So you have all these anecdotes that create a through line, a narrative that feels right. And that feeling is so powerful and personal that you seek confirmation of it. And so the parapsychologists essentially would develop a framework where, again, it sounds ridiculous nowadays, but you would get somebody who claims to have ESP, they would demonstrate ESP, and you would have a bunch of very smart, learned, paper-having, robe-wearing scientists. And if the scientists all discussed with each other and they could not think of a way that it was possible, then it must be actual ESP, which of course I'm describing also a magic show. Because, and this is where we introduce James Randi into the scene, because in that very first episode, we have to, our story takes place in the shadow of these two great colossus entities, Uri Geller and James Randi, right? Uri Geller, who claimed in every way to have the thing the world wanted. And when the world wants something enough, when there's a void, nature abhors a vacuum, somebody, usually the con men, is going to show up and say, I've got that, and then collect money. And then sometimes they're all like 1 second, and maybe they pull it off, in which case, they're a legitimate businessman, but more often than not, they're a con man. And so in that space, I, on this podcast, will not make any evaluation as to whether or not the claims are true or not. But Uri Geller definitely claimed to have the goods. And he had everything the world wanted from his...
he would go on The Tonight Show. Well, we'll get to that, but he would go on TV shows and elsewhere and use his mind to bend spoons and keys and pins.
And he could find water inside. See, dowsing was a big one. Drawing replication, the ability to see through things. And James Randi was of the opinion that these were magic tricks. And so he would go on shows and replicate the feats. And the story that we tell in episode 1 of Project Alpha is the most famous encounter, which objectively seems like it should have worked. It should have fixed things. James Randi gets word from Johnny Carson, who is a magician, that Uri Geller's going to come do psychic stuff on the show. As a fellow conjurer, he works with Johnny Carson and says, here are the test conditions. He might try this. Don't let him do this. You're going to want to, whatever you do, blank, 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 bring your own spoons, and so on and so on. And what happens is the most awkward 15 minutes in the history of television.
Right.
Just flop, sweat, and silence.
And this is when, the Tonight Show, 50% of American households were watching it. And Johnny Carson says, okay, Uri Geller, bend your spoons, bend your keys. And Uri Geller is like, and then realizes.
And Johnny Carson straight up no sells, doesn't give him help, doesn't keep the conversation afloat, just lets him choke on live air.
Right.
And the story, as trickles down, is that Uri Geller thought, well, that's it. I must be through. I'm over with. He does mention, I don't know, you weren't feeling the vibes. I wasn't feeling the vibes.
Yeah. This gift comes and goes, right? Like The Shining, it was cloudy tonight, so I don't read minds or whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, and nowadays in this internet attention economy, it's more common to understand that it's people very quickly forget what you're famous for.
Right.
They just know that you're famous. And if they remembered anything about Uri Geller, there's 3 parts to this sentence. Uri Geller was on the Tonight Show for an ESP thingy, and it went some way, either good or bad. I don't recall. And so instead, his star just went higher, right? And so you would think that the very public debunking would do something, and it did not. And so then you have, in this emotionally charged peak Cold War era, where they want there to be psychic soldiers, and you begin to get private investments in testing for ESP. And this is the story that I'm really proud we were able to uncover, because there were 2 kids, 18 years old-ish at the time, who applied for ESP tests in St. Louis. And
at Washington University.
At Washington University.
At a lab that was funded by one of the...
McDonnell Douglas.
Yeah, so a major airline manufacturer and defense contractor.
Yes.
Is funding a major ESP lab at a very highly regarded university.
Correct. And
this is already crazy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, and much like, I don't know how much of my own show to spoil. The reason we were attracted to this is because we had extraordinary access to the principal players. Right. My co-writer and co-creator, Justin Robert Young, was an intern at the James Randi Educational Foundation. He would help with those $1 Million Challenge paranormal tests. And I toured with a show in the spirit of James Randi. I called James Randi and got advice on how to perform psychic surgery that I later performed on Penn and Teller's show, Fool Us, and took college students on a 90-minute best of parapsychology stuff. And so we wanted to basically tell the full version of the original story that we heard, which was James Randi got 2 kids, taught them magic, sent them into the depths, and they made fools of the entire industry. It turns out that wasn't the story at all. Turns out kids have agency, and they did this on their own. And they looked up to James Randi, and they let him lead point. And the stories that emerge, we quickly discovered that through the interviews that this was less a story of a takedown of a monolith and more a story of 2 undercover detectives who got in too deep and who realized month after month that, oh, wait, these are humans who are trying to advance science and we're actively deceiving them, even though it's for a good end.
Right.
And because of the nature of storytelling, the simpler story wins. The story that emerges on live TV, there's an astonishing moment where, again, back in the monoculture, the entire world is watching as during a press conference, the students are asked, how do you do it? And they say, well, quite honestly, we cheat. And James Randi, shall we say, simplifies the narrative. Right. It is a sanded down narrative in which James Randi is at the center of it because he has the more tradable brand. And just to say James Randi plus Banachek plus Mike Edwards, all of it, even now I can barely get the whole sentence out as opposed to just saying James Randi, this iconic person.
So then, they go through their stuff where they're faking the people out there. And then the guy who ran the lab, Peter Phillips, who's a respected scientist, he's just completely destroyed by this.
Yeah, and this is pure speculation on my part, and that's one of the difficult things is, on the one hand, it's great to bring to light the boots on the ground experience of Mike and Banachek, who were just under these brutal test conditions where every single day they would have to essentially invent a new magic trick on the fly. And later, it's fascinating because Banachek became one of the greatest mentalists on the planet, specifically because he went through this brutal 2-year trial by fire of having to invent magic methods
where
on
they
the
were
fly
constantly like closing down the ability for them to cheat, and they would figure out a way to kind of wiggle out of that.
Yeah,
so they were still reading signs through a wall or bending stuff.
Yeah, and there would be a few examples that we get to cover in there, some neat moments where somebody sees something over somebody's shoulder, or there would be a gentle tee up, or maybe one person might set up something in a tricky way so that the other one could get the payoff hours later. But basically, they're tinkering with information inefficiency. And as the results were more and more amazing, the rules got more and more stringent, mostly because out of nowhere, they were getting letters from James Randi saying, by the way, if they were conjurers, they might be doing this. And so something that would work on day one, they would show up and now there's suddenly a glass partition. But he would notice that there's a bit of a gap. So maybe he could blow down and have it work. Then there's a gasket. But he realized that, if you made an excuse, they would pick it up and maybe a bit of sand would wedge it just enough. So this constant cat and mouse would give increasingly small, statistically insignificant results. But it was still enough that the lab kept on going, all the while setting up this big gotcha reveal.
Right. And then describe that, because there's a TV show, right, where a special where Randi and the two kids.
Yeah. So the show is called Magic or Miracle, and it's an interesting hodgepodge. You could tell it was sold as one thing, and then the producer wanted to make it something else. And so as a result, it's a little bit meandering, but the big moment was the reveal of Project Alpha. And it was really surreal to hear the firsthand accounts of these kids showing up and they're there on the spotlight. Now, nobody knows nothing when you're a late teenager. And so you think, well, this must be, objectively, it's going to be the most famous thing that ever happens to me. After this, thinks Mike Edwards, I'll go to Hollywood. And after this, everything will be fine. And so instead, it doesn't work out that way. Instead, it comes, it goes, and the narrative gets sanded down, and then you hear Project Alpha, you hear James Randi, and that's it. And that's a hard thing when you think of how much they gave up. And there's a bit of a moral question, because what is ethically the right thing to make the biggest impact? Because in one reality, you just keep spending money, and who's going to show up? Charlatan after charlatan after charlatan. All that money that could have been used to actually do real science to cure cancer and so on. But on the other hand, the factual collateral damage to the reputation of the lab, to the entire industry, like who knows what advancements might have happened. That's less the realm we cover, because we had access to the principles.
Yeah. Well, it's also, it's great, like you were talking about the Houdin story, or where listening to your show, it's like being in the David Mamet movie House of Games, or something where, or The Sting, where you think, oh, this one con, that's the con, and then you realize, oh, there's a reversal, which really keeps you guessing.
Yeah, and there usually is.
So what, I guess two things. One, why do we love to be conned and then have it revealed to us?
I don't know if you've read Will Storr's book, The Status Game, but he starts with an extraordinary simple statement: humans are status-seeking engines. And it's like, when you think of humans as, I don't know, like I sometimes think of a soup of folded proteins, and you shake it up, and the two folded proteins
that are having much deeper thoughts than I have.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. We're folded proteins in a shake.
You want to remain congruent, right? Yeah. And so when it comes to narratives, we're narrative seeking engines as well, right? Every Campbellian story is character says, who am I? bunch of stuff
Right.
happens,
Yeah.
figures out he's Luke
So,
Skywalker.
I mean, long before Google, we're doing autocomplete. We're making sense out of like, how does this end, or what is the story I'm in, and then you drive to that conclusion.
Exactly. And humans love, as best I can tell, to be almost right. We hate it when we're totally right. We like seeing 1 and 2.
Yeah.
We see the line. And if it's 3, we don't like it. That's predictable. That's
Mhm.
too perfect. And we also don't like it if it's oblique and wild. It seems like it's nonsense. But when it's almost right,
Mhm.
boy, do we love that. Which is why, for example, the very first scam that we talk about is I got suckered into buying what I thought / hoped were stolen speakers.
Right.
Because what I was sold was the line that, oh no, these are studio monitors for a strip club, and we just have a couple of extra. They're supposed to be $1,200. Look, you could see it on here.
Yeah.
And I was the one who saw 2 and 2 in front of me, put together, oh my God, these are stolen, but they're not going to tell me it's stolen.
Yeah.
So I go to the ATM, give them $350 and thank them. And I'm like, oh my God, I did it. I stuck it to the man while getting sweet speakers. Turns out they're just cheap garbage speakers. And I was the one who got scammed. And so likewise, when we hear stories, and that's part of what we try to do on the show, is we take those just so tales and figure out the legitimate top spin on it that you didn't see coming.
You know, I'm thinking as you're talking about people like Arthur Conan Doyle, right, who invents, or maybe with Poe in mind, who kind of created the first ratiocination detective, who uses his mind to figure out impossible mysteries. You get Sherlock Holmes, right, who is the ultimate avatar of kind of enlightenment rationality and figuring everything out. But then Arthur Conan Doyle is kind of a sad case where, so he's this man of science and rationality who then is conned in a variety of things, including, obviously fake pictures of fairies and things like that. Are people who pride themselves on rationality particularly able to be conned?
Yes, 100%. Well, just like humans are not very good at remembering. In theory, we all know that there are things that we do not know and things that we do not see, and worlds that are oblique to us, that we're surrounded by black boxes. In theory, everybody, our Vulcan brain says that's the case. But think of Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow.
Right.
That's System 1, System 2. Our guts are not so good at that. And sometimes it pays off. For example, Gavin de Becker's book, The Gift of Fear, he essentially says, look, humans, we ain't got scales, we ain't got claws, we ain't got teeth. We have one thing, a finely honed sense of intuition. And so when the bushes are shaking, we know we're in trouble, and that's why we won.
Right.
And
because you figure that's a lion, so you get out of there on the savannah. And those of us who are like, oh, that looks interesting, we're the ones who are eaten, and that's the end of the line.
Yeah, and as best I can tell, the game, and it's the same game that magicians and spectators play, but with a mark and the con man and the mark, that each gets one gift. The con man gets the gift of asymmetry of time. They get to spend months and months and months calculating this narrative and laying out all of the artifacts so that the mark will hopefully see this, see that, piece it together in their mind. Oh, these are stolen speakers, and then fall right into the trap. The mark, however, gets a finely honed sense of intuition, that gut feeling that so often we rationalize and talk ourselves out of. Only after something disastrous happened do we realize, oh, wait, I should have known the entire time.
So I love the way that you talk about the monoculture, which I would say it's probably for people under 50 at this point almost, where it's hard to remember a world where there were only a couple of sources of information. Kind of, the difference between CBS, NBC, and ABC News, say, it's like whatever, it's hard to know, but they're all kind of revered or all kind of trusted, and there's no knowledge outside of that. In that world, it's harder to understand that you're being fed a particular version of things, right? Now we live in a world of infinite YouTube channels and other sources of information. So it's not a monoculture anymore. How does this change the way we process information, and how do we develop a better, bullshit detector so that we're not constantly being suckered by a reality that is very appealing to us?
Yeah. So Darwin proposed a tree of life where you got a limb for mammals and on fungus and so on, and is constantly diverging. We see that with different cultures. In the monoculture days, whether the narrative from the news was right or wrong, at least it was shared, right? But now you can select the bubble that you want to live in. If you want to say whatever the New York Times says is a lie, then you can find a clubhouse where that's the fact. If you want to say both of them, all of the mainstream is a lie, you can find a clubhouse for that. If you want to say that, a culture where it's like that clubhouse got it wrong, you can find that. And so what we end up with is this self-repeating, self-similar fractal where because, and I think Will Storr has this right, we are status-seeking engines. Would you rather be king of the non-believers in this sub-conspiracy domain, or a peon, one of the sheeple who actually believes 9/11? And so what we have is the exact same objective information can now be dissected through different lenses and reinterpreted in different, some things we all have to agree on. But even then, we can't even agree that the world's flat at the moment, or sorry, that the world isn't flat.
I think we know what's
so, did I just bust myself?
But, it's liberating though, too, right? To be out of the monoculture, because the monoculture kind of sucked, right? It's, because if you didn't buy into a big story, or the story that everybody agreed was reality, it's, it was lonely, it was difficult, and it was wrong, right, in many ways. But so now we're in this more fragmented universe. How do we navigate this and assess different forms of information without either becoming very cynical or overly skeptical or just crazy?
So one way for me is if you Neil Stephenson's book, The Diamond Age, posits a post-abundance economy thanks to nanobots, right? Where just kind of the Victorians decide, screw it, we're just going to pick mid-century, 19th century England, and that's how we're going to live, right? We have that now with the internet, with all these different strata. And so if, number one, rule one is I'm out of the business of deciding one is better or more than or less than, but I recognize that these different pockets exist. At which point, it got pretty ugly because certain words mean different things. If you're coded team red or team blue, politically, there are code words to indicate things. And that's very dividing. And to be honest, I'm actually very hopeful, thanks to AI. Like, I make so many cultural meme references that are appropriate to a 50-year-old person in Austin, Texas, that would mean nothing to my children. And so I actually said, please translate the following sentences, Simpson reference, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, to my 16-year-old daughter. And then it just spat out. And she's like, oh yeah, I get that. I don't know what that looks like. And I don't
So that's
think
like a babble fish for
cultural babble fish.
That's amazing.
And that is possible now in a way that technologically it required somebody who was, aged in between two different demographics. So I think that I am hopeful that technology, that artificial intelligence will allow us to see the humanity in each other.
Talk about your kind of politics and maybe your epistemology, and where does that come from? You consider yourself libertarian?
Oh, very much so.
Yeah. So again, it's good. Like, we want hyper-individualized everything, right? But then you need to be able to navigate your reality with other people.
I mean, there's a difference between what we want and what we know is best. What I want is to eat candy all day. What is best is for me to eat vegetables. And the libertarianism is inherently ugly. It is the definition of ugly. If we all agree that it was, it's the movie Pleasantville. Like that's a terrible place but everything is surface level pleasant while secretly deeply unpleasant. Libertarianism is about taking all that ugliness and putting it on the surface. Snow Crash by Neil Stephenson. First time I read it, like, oh, this is a hellscape. And then second time I read it, I'm like, or an anarcho-libertarian paradise, where everything from currency to the roads are up for grabs. It is objectively true that competition is the tide that lifts all the boats. It is also objectively true that I personally would prefer that I have no competition. It is objectively true that the internet and the sharing of magic methods has yielded the whole art of magic is elevated by the fact that we are not limited by access to a library or the fact that your parents bought you a magic set or the local magic shop either does or does not exist in your small town. All of magic is better than ever, and you see it. It's held in higher regard than at any point in my life. Now, it was ugly to get there because in the 1980s, you remember this, in the 1980s, there was a time, and this is hard to believe, that stand-up comedy and magic were held roughly in the same regard. They were peers.
Yeah.
But what happened is as comedy clubs went crazy, some people, they're like, I work very hard, I can do magic. And that was a filter that kept people out. Whereas everybody, oh, I'm funny.
Yeah.
And so too many people, there was a time Austin had, I think, 3-4 comedy clubs, right? And then in the early 90s, all of that collapsed because everybody was stealing each other's material. There was no enforcement. And so comedy had to go through a metamorphosis by the time you get to like the Bob Oden, the Ben Stiller show and the emergence of Mr. Show and the kind of next wave of comedy. Meanwhile, during that same time, magicians embraced what looks to me like a cartel mindset. There's only going to be 12 canonical illusions. We're all going to wear the same purple sequin shirts. And you saw that with the primetime World's Greatest Magic specials, where it was all the same. And then so magic got their comeuppance with a rejection of that with David Blaine, and then a rejection of David Blaine with the hyper polish of Chris Angel. And then along comes the internet. And I was... it's hard to be a frontiersman when nobody knows what the rules are. Is the internet TV? Are we ruining magic or are we bringing it to the masses? And there's still a segment of magic that perceives as me teaching magic on the internet is ruining the art. And meanwhile, there's not a magician in America under 30 who hasn't seen the spiky haired dude on YouTube teaching tricks.
You've mentioned Penn and Teller. How important are they to kind of the way that you think about magic and also the culture? Because they are, I mean, they're like the best performers ever, but they kind of say, okay, we're going to con you. Yeah. And then they do it.
Well, and they brought that narrative layer to it and that honesty. And to be honest, what the metaphor that I think of as playing chess comes from watching them. Like, oh, this is great. They're calling it out. They're saying, we dare you. Teller, when I was 19 years old, I drove out to Houston from Austin to see Penn and Teller for the first time live. And I had Teller sign a card to my bastard son, which got a chuckle and it started an email correspondence over the years. And in one of the essays he wrote me, he said, in theater, there's a willing suspension of disbelief. If I hold up a stick and say, this is a sword, you're like, all right, sure, where's this headed? And then you go along and maybe you cry or laugh or whatever. But in magic, it's non-consensual. You're like, this is a sword. You're like, yeah, what the fuck just happened? That's a sword. And in that wonder, in that chess match is the heart of magic. And nobody's better at it than Penn and Teller. And it's been fascinating to watch their rise first as counterculture, but now culture. They have the #1 show on the CW. Yeah. And so I don't know what comes next after them.
What was the trick that you did on Fool Us?
It was psychic surgery, and
explain that.
So, as a matter of fact, it's part of why we lost Andy Kaufman as early as we did. Back in the 1970s, in the Philippines, were healing practitioners who claimed that, if you've ever seen Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, they claimed they could do that. Reach inside you, pull out tumors. And what it was a little bit of sleight of hand with chicken guts. They just palm some chicken guts in blood, and skin is very pliable. It mushes more than you would expect, and it feels weird. And they would pull out these chicken giblets and then wipe you down and you were fine. And the weird part is we know that the placebo effect is so powerful. And we know that it's so powerful, it works even when you know it's a placebo. We know that red placebos work better than blue placebos. Big placebos work better than small placebos. And in the case of acupuncture, paranormal stuff aside, we know that painful placebos work better than painless placebos. And in the case of, imagine a placebo so powerful that you get on a plane, you spend your money, you have somebody physically inflict pain on you. That is a such a powerful placebo that, you live your life in a way that is congruent as though you're healed. And for some people, long enough, it worked. But it was a fraud ultimately, and got exposed as such by the likes of James Randi.
Yeah.
And so being a touring stage magician, I've always felt like if it's important, you should never say it aloud. So what I won't do is say psychic surgery is fake. But what I will do is I'll say, hey, here's a card, burn it up, mix it with pudding, eat it. That's a pretty vanished card, right? Now lay on the table, I'm going to psychically, blood and guts, doing it for comedic effect. Really, the goal of that is to take the teeth out of the con, the fraud of psychic surgery. It's a similar thing happened with the Ku Klux Klan and the radio program Superman. By revealing the inner workings, the deeply held secrets of the Ku Klux Klan, they suddenly became a punching bag and a laughingstock. And so that did a lot to move the needle. And likewise, that's what I wanted to do with the trick that I did on Penn and Teller Fool Us.
How did you get interested in magic and kind of con man stuff?
You mentioned Penn and Teller, and we don't get to choose when and where we imprint on our artistic heroes. But for me, it was in second grade, and it was their PBS show, Penn and Teller Go Public, where they did a bunch of tricks, but then they said, if you have one of these VCRs, press record, we're going to teach you one. And so they did a fake news report where they taught a simple card force. And at the second grade, I did it for my family. And then we turned on the TV, and the news had Penn Jillette stop and say, is this your card? And that ecstasy, that first hit, I'm still chasing that high.
Why aren't there more women involved in magic?
The internet. I mean, it's straight up. Let me put it this way. Before the internet, the only way for the methods, when I was 19 years old, I would go to a cafeteria here in Austin, IBM Ring 60. And a curious thing would happen. We would do the minutes and the thing and the lecture, and then everyone would hang out in session with each other. And it was weird because people would do the same tricks with the same lines, and everybody would laugh. And I was like, that was the same one as last month. Why are we all laughing again? And now I realize what we were doing is we were all aping the structure of our performance so we could all compare notes and borrow each other's bits, rhythms, routines, plots, and techniques. And then all of a sudden, the internet came along, and there was a much more direct route for that information. It became an efficient market of information. You didn't have to show up. Now, for some people, that was great because it opened a lot of doors. For other people, it suddenly made their previously easy job harder. And so it's just like libertarianism. It was ugly to suddenly have anybody be able to do it. But also, it did the very healthy thing of if there was a girl of any age in that room, she was, and in this case, it was my wife, she was selected for every single trick. And so these archetypes become established. Oh, are you a woman adjacent to magic? Your job is to be the assistant. And then all of a sudden people come to magic and nobody knows the expectations, the rules. All of a sudden, a 7-year-old girl is discovering a trick and does it for her dad. Nobody told her that that's not how it's supposed to go. And I do believe that there's something as close to real magic that happened in that quiet revolution.
So it's democratizing because it's no longer passed through secret handshakes or social situations. It's much more wide open.
Yeah, and it also eliminated some truly awful, grotesque artifacts. Like, for example, similar to the highly rigid structure of, say, the Catholic Church, the highly... two ways to learn magic. Nowadays, we learn it on the internet. When I was young, the only way to learn magic was for a 14-year-old boy to go in a room with a 45-year-old man who explained the importance of keeping a secret. And exactly what you would expect happened.
Is there?
sorry. I can't speak with authority. That made it sound like a specific thing.
You mentioned James Randi, and Randi created, he is like the ultimate skeptic kind of, and he helped introduce what we talk about as skepticism, particularly about paranormal or religious sensibility. Atheists have kind of won. There are a lot of religious people in America, but we're a much more secular society. Why is the skeptic movement over? And if it is it because it's achieved its basic goals to make us all more reflective on what we believe, or did it die out for some other reason?
I was surprised by the overlap between the skeptic movement and the atheist movement.
Yeah.
The first time I went to an amazing meeting, I was really confused. I'm like, hey man, we're all here to debunk people who defraud the bereaved, right?
Yeah.
And they're like, yeah. And I get to shout, there is no God.
Right.
And I was like, why would you do that?
Yeah.
And it very clearly, there's a subsection of people, talked about this with Andrew Heaton, where there's a flavor of atheist who they still believe in the supernatural, but they're mad at the fact that, I don't know, somebody finger banged their girlfriend at church camp or whatever, that's what their real issue is not about rationalism or double blind testing or what have you. And in the case of skepticism, I mean, who are they punching against at this point? I mean, there is no monoculture that is pumping simplified universal narratives at us that need to be corrected by loud, angry, shouting people. Instead, I guess Twitter was the closest to it, but that seems to have wildly fragmented.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly not a monoculture. It might be loud and annoying. But where is the best place to find what you're up to?
The Modern Rogue on YouTube, youtube.com/Modern Rogue. I'm perpetually on a quest to be the ultimate gentleman, warrior, and scoundrel. Yeah,
what is, out of warrior, gentleman, and scoundrel, which is your preferred role?
When I was in my 30s, I was playing the scoundrel.
Yeah.
When I was in my 40s, I tried on the warrior. Now that I'm 50, it's gentleman all the way.
Well, we'll leave it there. Brian Brushwood, thanks for talking to us.
Thank you.